Good evening. Great. Can you all hear me? It sounds like it's coming through. We were having some issues with the mic earlier, but it sounds like we're worked out. I'd like to first say welcome. My name is Marius Johnson Malone. I am the Deputy Director of Community-Based Studies for Better Together. I want to thank you for joining us this evening for this event. We are excited to be able to come out into the community and talk to folks about these recommendations and hear from you all and answer some of your questions. I want to give you a very brief overview of what tonight will be like. I will give a brief presentation on what the recommendations are, just at a high-level view. Hopefully you got a brochure. I also encourage you to visit our website, bettertogetherstl.com, for a more in-depth explanation of the process and the plan. But I'll go through some of the highlights here this evening, and then we will have some questions. We had some folks submit questions ahead of time online, and so we will answer some of those, but we'll also take questions from folks here in attendance, obviously. I'll speak a little bit more about that when we get to that portion of the evening. But with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So just as a starting point, just sort of as a recap of why this project and these recommendations even exist, sort of trying to understand what are the problems that we have in St. Louis that led to this whole process and these recommendations in the first place. Number one is that when Better Together started its work in late 2013, early 2014, one of the first things we did was trying to understand what the governments in St. Louis City and St. Louis County, the 88 municipalities at the time, 90, and the 23 fire protection districts, what were they spending to deliver the services that they delivered to the residents here? And what we found is that what we have is pretty expensive. We spent, at that point, $2.3 billion every year on those services, municipal level services. And when we compared that to how other regions were operating to deliver similar services, what we found is that we spend, when you looked at it on a per capita basis, we spend over $750 million annually, more than our peers in Indianapolis, and almost $1 billion more than what they spend in Louisville. So this government structure that we have is exceedingly expensive. Despite that, we have had and continue to have pretty deep disparities in service provisions across the region. So we know, for instance, that in some areas, you as a community, as a resident, you might get all the things you could need from your local government. Great park service, great trash service, professional policing, while in other areas they struggle to deliver even the most basic level of service like public safety. And in many of those areas that are struggling to deliver those services at a base level are the ones that are most in need of them, given some of the issues that those communities are facing. For instance, when we did our study, 75% of our police departments, our 55 police departments in St. Louis City and County, were unaccredited. And the municipal courts were a real source of consternation. They were having an incredibly negative effect on people's lives as we saw communities that were overly pulling over and having negative interactions with their citizens that were changing their lives, driven by this drive to have increased revenue from municipal court fines and fees. We also saw that among these local governments, we had a highly intense internal competition among these governments. So rather than us competing for new development with other regions like Nashville, like Chicago, Kansas City, Indianapolis, we were fighting with each other over which municipality or which locality was going to get the next retail development. And so we weren't growing the pie, we were just sort of shifting the resources around the region and calling it economic development. We continue to see population decline in both St. Louis City and St. Louis County. At the same time, we are witnessing the costs increasing for these services. So I mentioned that when we started our work in 2013, we spent about $2.3 billion delivering services. 3 short years later, that number has increased to $2.5 billion. We saw an increase of $119 million over the course of 3 years. And that was driven largely by over 130 tax increases in St. Louis City and St. Louis County since April of 2012. In addition to all of this, we have just a real structural inability to deliver any sort of collective action, to have any ability as a region to have a shared vision. So the city mayor does not answer to the county executive does not answer to the mayor of St. Louis. None of the municipal mayors necessarily answer to each other or the county executive, and what that leaves us with is a structure that often renders us reactive to opportunities and to problems rather than being able to be proactive to seeking solutions or opportunities for growth in this region. And again, we have increased taxes. As I mentioned, since April 2012, we've had 138 local tax increases from those governments that I mentioned. So in effect, what we're seeing is we are paying more money to provide the same services to fewer people. And we know that that trend is only going to continue. It's not sustainable. The status quo is not sustainable for our future. So we live in a system that was set up to fail. One of the things I'd like to point out here is that, I think there's a misperception out there around who is to blame for this structure, and in particular that we as an organization or that we as individuals blame elected officials. And I feel very strongly that is not the case, that it is elected officials' fault for this structure. Most of the elected officials in this region are doing the thing that they think is right for their municipality, but we have a structure that is set up where that competition is baked into the structure, and so necessarily our region is losing out when we have this intense competition. So within that system, we have 55 police departments, 78 municipal courts, 88 municipalities, and over 200 special taxing districts. So this all led us to the conclusion, and our interviews with stakeholders, our listening sessions with the public, our look at the data all led us to the conclusion that St. Louis needs change. So just to give a broad strokes overview of our process as an organization, we were formed in late 2013, really because there were some civic leaders in the area who were interested in seeing the relationship between St. Louis City and St. Louis County addressed. They wanted to understand this fragmentation issue, and they quickly found out that there was very little data to inform any sort of conversation or any sort of action on this. You couldn't even go somewhere and find out what the budgets for these governments were, what the number of police departments were. Any of that basic information didn't exist in a central place prior to organization. So they formed Better Together to do the research to understand what is the landscape for this. So we spent the first 3 years of our time looking at 6 areas of municipal level services, starting with public finance, going to economic development, public health, public safety, parks and recreation, and general administration. Just trying to understand the basic information. What is the status quo of delivering that service at the regional level? So not necessarily what is DePere doing versus Chesterfield, or what is Hazelwood doing versus Green Park, but how do we as a region deliver services? And then understanding what best practices were both in this region and nationally, and how we as a region stacked up to those best practices. And one of the things that was really important to us from the beginning of our process was that we didn't just look at the data that we received from these governments, but we also took into consideration the experiences of the people who lived in these communities. And so for each of our study areas, we had committees of people that worked in those areas. We consulted with folks from across the region. We had listening sessions and town hall events throughout all of the work to make sure that the findings were reflected not just the data, but again, the experiences of people that live here. From that, we came to a point where we said, okay, this is what we found in our initial studies. We also wanted to understand what were the common themes across the study areas. And that's where you came with those findings of this is expensive, we have internal competition that is unhealthy, and we also have these disparity in services and a lack of regional vision. And we said, okay, what's next? We know that St. Louis has done a myriad of studies over the last several decades trying to understand the problems that we have here, but oftentimes those studies are performed, there's perhaps an educational period, and then nothing from an action standpoint takes place. And so we wanted to change that and make sure that this was not like similar efforts in the past. And so we decided to have a task force of citizens help us to think about what some solutions and what some different ways to operate these governments and our structure of governance might look like in this region. So in 2017, we formed a city-county governance task force to continue doing listening, hold public sessions to gather community input, ensure that we were looking at best practices again here locally, but also from places who had been down this path before, places who understood what successes they had achieved from restructuring their government and also understood the pitfalls and making sure that we could learn the lessons and craft some recommendations that were unique to St. Louis's needs and the culture here. So the task force recommendations, as you know, were released earlier this year, and that leads us to this point. So what did we learn? Well, from the task force's process, 4 key principles emerged from our listening sessions, from our research. People wanted to see unified economic development voice, particularly from a government perspective. They wanted to see unified public safety, specifically around policing and courts, given what's happened here locally in those fronts in recent years. They wanted to see more efficient use of taxpayer dollars. If we're overspending by $750 million every year, I think people wanted to see that that was changed in the future. And then lastly, what we heard very clearly from folks across the region is that they wanted to see the cultural identities of their communities maintained. And that was something we heard whether you were in the city of St. Louis, whether you're here in Des Peres, in North County, or in South County. That was something people felt very strongly was a part of the fabric of St. Louis. And from that emerged the recommendations that you have seen and heard about in the public, and we'll show a brief video to highlight the top line recommendations there. A St. Louis metro city would unite the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County into one metro city, creating a new government to replace what is currently 2 county governments. We would have one metro city government with a metro mayor and a 33-member metro council. A united voice to address regional economic planning and development, better equipping us to create jobs for the people who live here and the people who want to live here. Consolidated human services, allowing us to better address the health, housing, economic, and safety needs of residents. One professional police department, municipal court, and metro city prosecutor, uniting efforts to address public safety and eliminating waste that harms our community. Preserving the neighborhood and municipal identities that many of us grew up with. Under this new form of government, we would have one police department for the region, one court system for our municipal courts, one elected prosecutor, an elected assessor, an elected metro mayor, 33-member metro council for this one metro city for the region. If this effort is successful, there would be a vote in November of 2020 to bring about this new form of government for our state. And it would begin a 2-year transition period in January of 2021. During that transition period, the heads of the current combining counties, the head of the city of St. Louis, so the mayor of the city of St. Louis, and the county executive of St. Louis County would be charged with leading that transition period to bring together those departments from the governments. During that period, they would also be charged with appointing an independent, nonpartisan expert to draw the legislative districts for that metro council that would then be approved by the current county council and the board of aldermen. And then the first election for the metro council would be in November of 2022. In November of 2023, those individuals would take office. And then in 2024, the first election for the metro mayor, the metro assessor, and the metro prosecutor would take place. And in January 2025, those individuals would take office as well. So with that, I'm going to pause for a moment, and we are going to begin to take questions from the audience. Here's how I would like for this portion of the evening to work. I know that we have lots of questions from you all, and I'm excited to hear. Because we have so many folks in attendance tonight, and because we want to make sure we get to hear from as many people as possible, I would ask a couple things. Number one, if you want to begin to line up over here, we'll have a microphone. There's a microphone stand to my left, your right, and we will take questions from there. I ask that you limit your question to a maximum of 2 minutes. It's a pretty long time, but maximum of 2 minutes. We will cut you off so that we can make sure to get to as many people as possible. And then we'll limit yourself to one question. If there's a really clear follow-up as a part of that, you can add that on, but we want to make sure, again, that we can hear from as many folks as possible. So we'll start with one of our questions that was submitted from one of the participants ahead of time.
Okay, so this question comes from Chesterfield, and the question is, why have school and fire districts been excluded from the plan?
The question was about schools and fire districts. So I've said that, it was not part of our initial mission as an organization to look at schools. Despite that, when the Ferguson Commission did their work, we we're named as a responsible body for our ability to sort of collect data from these local governments. We did some data collection for others who were thinking about forming a task force around schools, but that is not what our work has been. We absolutely, obviously understand the value of education, but we wouldn't want to step outside of the scope of our work and where we've developed some level of expertise to make recommendations that are not well-founded in a process that has been led by the community. On fire protection districts, that one, it's complicated because we did study fire protection, and the reality is, when I mentioned those 4 principles that emerged from the process of the task force, specifically related to seeing some unification around those service areas and that piece about more efficient use of tax dollars, what we found was that in looking at the fire protection districts, because of the incredibly disparate costs of our current landscape, for instance, a private in the city of St. Louis in the fire department makes around $40,000 a year, whereas a private in parts of St. Louis County makes upward of $60,000, $70,000 a year. It was not going to be feasible to try and combine those entities while having a responsibly cost-efficient fire protection service. And so one of the things that we did learn as we looked at other regions and how they went about restructuring themselves and reorganizing themselves was that not everything had to be done at one time, and there were further opportunities for consolidation and for efficiencies to be found down the road. And we think fire protection is one of those, but to do it on just right off the bat, all under one structure was not the way that would be responsive and responsible for St. Louis taxpayers. So with that, we'll go to our first question.
So my understanding from your slide was that there'll be a 2-year period before the new Metro Council is installed. And so I'm assuming during that 2-year period, the Metro Mayor and the transition mayor would not be answerable to anyone, not the voting public nor any kind of a council. Is that correct? And if so, can you explain how that would work?
So the question is about the 2-year transition period and whether or not the Metro Mayor and the transition mayor, so the county executive and the mayor of St. Louis, are accountable to anybody, whether from the public perspective or from any elected body. During that period, the county council and the board of aldermen will still exist. All of the elected officials for the municipalities would still exist as well. And in fact, there are some pieces very specifically that have to have approval from the county council and the board of aldermen. One of the things that those 2 individuals will be charged with doing is creating what is called a reorganization plan that is really looking at how do we go from where we are today to a new structure, particularly from an administrative standpoint, looking at the current departments for the respective governments and how do we bring those together. They will then have to submit that reorganization plan for approval to the newly elected Metro Council. And so there's pieces in addition to that piece, but there are also requirements for public engagement on that and then the review of ordinances from the county councilor during that transition period. So there's absolutely opportunities for accountability. Thank you. Sorry, one thing, and I apologize I didn't say this. If you could, when you come up, state your name, just so I can have an understanding of who's in the room. What was your name, sir?
Peter Smith.
Peter Smith. Thank you, sir.
My name is James Yelton. I have a couple of questions for you.
Yes, sir.
The November 2020 vote that you put on the board there, it was kind of misleading. Is that a state vote or is that a municipal St. Louis County and St. Louis City vote?
It is a state vote, yeah. So the recommendations, the specific recommendations that came from the task force require a constitutional amendment. The way that St. Louis City and County are currently structured is actually in Missouri's Constitution, so it necessitates a constitutional amendment. There is a carve-out for allowing for a local vote only for changing that structure. It's called the Board of Freeholders. I think some of you have probably heard about that process. The desire to do 2 of those key principles, so particularly merging the police departments and the municipal courts, paired with the ability to maintain municipalities and maintain those municipal identities, was not something that our lawyers and our legal advice said was going to be doable without significant challenge under the Board of Freeholders. And so the regular way of amending the Missouri Constitution was required, and that is through a statewide vote, sir.
My understanding is you're looking for public inputs on this. If that's the case, why have you already submitted your plan?
So we've had public input for 5 years as a part of this process. We've also will continue. I'm sorry? So, okay, we've had several public meetings about this work, and I also want to be clear that Better Together as an organization did not actually submit that. It was the Unite STL, which is a different organization. But to your point, you know, I think there was a timing issue, and this is part of the public input process, but there's been lots of public input up to this point as well.
You didn't answer my question, but
Oh, I
that's fine.
apologize. Can you restate it?
I said, you're looking for public inputs, but you have already submitted your plan.
My response was that we have had public inputs. We've spoken to over 10,000 people as a part of our processes, whether that be. We've had events at this location on multiple occasions. I apologize if you didn't hear about it, but 10,000 other folks heard about it and attended. Whether that be through community meetings, town halls, presentations at community groups, we've been out, and so you know I'm sorry that if that was not reached to you and your neighbors, but I apologize for that.
All right, one other question.
Yes, sir.
St. Louis City is over $2.5 million in debt, and all assets will go to the St. Louis Metropolitan City. So isn't that actually a bailout?
No. Two things there. There's two inaccuracies as a part of what you just said. The city is not $2.5 billion in debt. They have, I believe it's a little under $2 billion in debt. Some of that is, a good portion of that is directly tied to the airport and that asset. And those assets actually don't transfer automatically to the Metro City. They stay with what will become the St. Louis Municipal Corporation. If the Metro City decides that they, at some point down the future, the elected officials of the Metro City decide that they want to take on those assets, they can. But one of the things that we heard from folks in rooms like this was that whatever the recommendations looked like, they wanted to be sure that it was not a bailout. We heard that loud and clear, and so we were very clear about ensuring that no one's debt from any municipality, whether it be from the city of St. Louis or any municipality in the county, transferred to any of the residents of any of the other jurisdictions. And so that debt that exists in the city of St. Louis today will stay with the municipal corporation, the St. Louis Municipal Corporation, that will be set up and left behind and will have to be paid for by revenues generated within that corporation.
So it is a bailout?
No, that's the opposite of what I just said, sir.
No. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Charlotte D'Alfonso, and I did attend some of those things that you're talking about in 2013, and I felt that they didn't have the answers when I asked questions, and I don't feel like it's a real representation or a lot of information that was given to people at that time. While I don't disagree with that there's some certain things about St. Louis that needs to change, I do want to know why you didn't work with municipalities who have accredited police stations, who are already doing things with consolidation, to see what is working within them. If you are also talking about bigger cities, for example, Nashville, when they did their big consolidation, it failed originally. And then when they went back and they talked with the municipalities and they worked together, then it passed. And so I'm really concerned that the municipalities have not been included in these discussions, especially municipalities that are successful. My other concern is when you're talking about electing the council in 2022, and the mayor and your assessor not till 2025, I don't know why you wouldn't elect them all at the beginning. It kind of feels like there's no representation that is elected. It feels like I will be taxed without representation. So if you could answer those two questions, please.
So your first question, for those who couldn't hear, was asking why we did not consult more closely with the municipalities. Particularly-
Especially the successful municipalities that you're complaining about accredited police stations and those types of things. Why weren't they included in those conversations?
So that's actually sort of a misnomer, because we did talk to municipalities, particularly in the beginning.
So, wait. I am a council person from one of those successful. I've attended these meetings. I've never been contacted. Neither have any of my other council members, and we've had zero. I know my own council has had zero input into this process, and it doesn't feel to me, attending municipal league, that you have had successful conversations or cooperation with them either. That is why they've come up with their own plan. So I wouldn't agree that you've discussed with some successful municipalities.
Well, there have been a lot over the last 6 years, but to your point,
So I've been a council member for 8 years.
okay,
And I have not been contacted.
okay. So one of the first things we did was consult and reach out to the municipal league when we started this process as the representative body of the municipal league. They initially were uninterested in engaging with our organization, and then once we started doing the research, we, frankly, because of a personal relationship that our chairman at the time, Bert Walker, our board chairman, had with the chairman of the municipal league at the time from Clarkson Valley, there was a desire to continue to make sure that there was a seat at the table for the municipal league. And so we had representatives from the municipal league on our committees for the studies, for the first several studies. Those individuals stopped coming, and the municipal league stopped appointing people to those committees. We also did
So
reach
one
out
of the
even for
things
our-
cities are required to do is follow the Sunshine Law and have a certain level of transparency. Could that potentially be why? Because cities are feeling that this has not been a very transparent reason, and because we are beholden to everyone who has elected you to follow the Sunshine Laws, and because this was not a transparent process, could that be part of the reason?
I can't speak for the motivations for why they did or did not participate at what the level is. I mean, you would have to ask those individuals. But I also remember very clearly in January of 2014, standing in this room with our executive director, who stood before a room of 200 representatives from municipalities and took their questions. And frankly, it was not a particularly productive meeting because there was a lot of mistrust, and rather than engaging in a way that would yield positive results, there was a lot of pushback. Despite that, we still tried to continue to engage with the municipal league. Before we released our first study, we met with representatives from, I know, at least 3 municipalities.
Do you know what those municipalities are?
I don't want to put them on the spot, but I will say, Brentwood, Maryland Heights, and De Pere at that point to have some conversation before we released our first study. And so the idea that we've not engaged municipalities, was it at the level where we talked to every elected official in the region? No, we did not talk to all 571 aldermen. We did not talk to the 684 elected
Did you
officials. for
talk
this
to
region,
the
but
municipalities that had the 25% of accredited police
we
forces?
did,
that you-
and even for our police study, we sat and we had a meeting with the St. Louis Area Police Chiefs Association. And I will tell you, just from to be candid and frank, the reception we received at each point of the process was not one of, let's look at our problems and see how we can do things differently. It was, we do things fine today, leave us alone.
I would disagree with
So,
that.
so I'm gonna wrap up, because a lot of people obviously agree with that sentiment, but I think when you talked, well, so there's a disagreement, and that was
I will
actually,
let- I will let
that
the
was,
next person
yes,
have
that
the
was actually going to
question.
be my point, is that the things we heard from a broader group of citizens was not the thing that we heard from those officials, and so we continued to do our work and try to involve people along the process, and I'm sorry if you were not engaged in that.
Myself nor anyone in my city government.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ellen Lawrence. I questions most related to the budget that you prepared and some of the statements about that. But first, I'd like to say, I also attended a number of meetings, I believe in 2013. I'm going to ask you the same thing I asked then and did not get an answer to. I think part of the problem with the budgets that are out of control in some of the cities in our area are lack of transparency, lack of good governance, and corruption. And I have not seen in your documentation how you're going to handle transparency, good governance, and how you're going to fight corruption, because I think when you have a corrupt government, it's much more expensive. So that's number one. Number two is I actually went through the budget you had, and I do have some issues with your assumptions, because you can assume anything you want and come up with, you can start with what you want and work backwards till you find some assumptions that work. But I'm just going to go through a couple of the ones that really stood out to me. The 1% annual growth in sales tax revenues. I don't know anyone else who thinks sales taxes are going to go up and not down. The 2% annual increase in property tax per standard adjustment. It almost seemed to me that you had conflated personal property taxes and real estate taxes, but it could be just real estate taxes. But you don't take, I think we're headed to another recession. So how have you taken that into account when those taxes are going to go down and not up? And when you talk about continued reduction in court fines and fees, I believe that a lot of those excessive fees have already been reduced, because I don't think that Senate Bill 5 allows a municipality to have more than 8% of their budget as part of those fees. So I'm not sure how you're going to slice and dice
20%.
those.
But, so let me address your first question of transparency and
Good governance
good
and
governance.
corruption.
How does this proposal address that? I would say in two primary ways. Number one is that I think part of the issue in any society and ensuring that you have transparency is having the resources to have the public looking at those things. And so,
You can have people come to every meeting. That doesn't cost money.
but what I'm saying is our current structure, I think, doesn't allow for our local news sources, for instance, to be vigilant monitors of all of the governments that we have in this region, and having a single government that delivers most of these services on a regional basis will enhance that ability for the public to keep an eye on these governments. Number two, and I think this is going to be probably a theme that you'll hear multiple times over the course of this evening, is that the recommendations from this task force are a framework for a structure of governance. It does not include specific policies on how you want police service to be delivered, how you want to do this policy and all those other things. Those are absolutely necessary components of ensuring good governance. And there has to be a continued and separate process for ensuring that the public has a strong input on how those things are operationalized, not just from a structural standpoint. And I think you will see some of that work happening soon and out loud. So the second question was about some of the assumptions for the budget. Most of the assumptions that you specified around the sales tax growth and the property tax growth rates and the ability to assume those things as adequate is based not just on what we think will happen, but based on the trends that we've seen in the last several years locally, and also how other governments rely on, other governments in the state of Missouri, and how they rely on the assumptions they use to project out revenues and different things like that. But really the core of that piece is, and the core takeaway from that is not just what the potential savings could be for a new form of government, but to ensure that this government can be solvent from day one moving forward. And that was the primary goal of that work.
Well, mark me skeptical, but I want to end with just one comment. I think this is all about disenfranchisement.
I disagree, but I thank you for your comment. Hi,
Good evening, Mr. Malone.
good evening.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, how are you?
It's good to see you again.
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
Could you remind me your name and so the
My
folks
name
that-
is Missy Waldman, and I'm with the city of Olivet. That's where I live. That's where I grew up. That's where my parents built their home, and I bought my home, sir. So as you know, I told you last time that I'm a social worker for over 36 years, and I've worked in every area of St. Louis City and St. Louis County. And in my career, I saw the things that impacted families every day were lack of adequate food, nutrition, lack of adequate housing, lack of adequate education, and lack of adequate health care. And you know, last time I agreed with you that the age difference of health care can be 18 years, and I said our elected officials in Jefferson City could have addressed that by expanding Medicaid. My two questions to you, sir. Why does a kid from the project succeed and become a federal judge and another kid from Wildwood die from a drug overdose? My point is, equal opportunity does not guarantee equal outcomes. 73% of Missourians outside the region should not be allowed to vote to impact change in this region. But the merger will end up going to a state vote. So I ask you, how a 25-page, better together, February revised 2019 recommended constitutional amendment will get crafted into ballot language and approved by the Secretary of State? What is the ballot going to look like? And are we going to have a multiple-page ballot? Because last week, somebody in a tentacle smelling asked for sunshine law and saying that cities were already violating with regards to the ballot. So, okay, is there a ballot? What's it going to look like? That's my first question. Go ahead, sir.
So what will actually appear on the ballot is actually up to the Secretary of State. I think they, in conjunction with the State Auditor's Office and the State Attorney General's Office, are the ones who form that language. And I believe we're almost to the end of what they have, time period they have statutorily to propose language on that. So I don't know yet is the answer.
Do we know when that will be made public?
Sometime, I think, in the next week. I don't have the specific date in mind, but we can find that out for you.
Okay, okay. Now, sir, I want to go to Appendix F, the amendment summary and language. Roman numeral number 4C. It states, during the transition period, property, contracts, records, and personnel related to general district services are transferred to Metro City. Employees transferred continue in service with seniority, compensation, and benefits intact until otherwise provided by the Metro City. So I'm going to ask you when I'm done here, what is meant by until otherwise? Who are the employees transferred? Who won't be employees transferred? And what does it mean until otherwise provided by the Metro City with regards to the employees? How many employees from municipalities will be laid off? And if you don't lay off any employees, how will you see the $1 billion in savings that Better Together projects? Attrition alone will not produce those savings in the time frame that you guys have projected, sir. Go ahead.
So there's two questions that I think I heard there. One is about which employees would become employees of the Metro City, and one is, can you state the second one again?
Sure. Employees transferred continue in service with seniority, compensation, and benefits intact until otherwise provided by the
Can
Metro City.
Right. The question right there at the end that you mentioned.
Right. What does it mean until otherwise provided by the Metro City with regards to the employees?
Oh, actually, I got it. You asked about how the savings would be realized.
And how many employees
Yes,
from municipalities will be laid off? And if you don't
So
lay
the two
off anyone,
questions,
the
which
savings.
employees become employees of the Metro City, and then how are savings going to be realized? So that is determined by service area. So if a service area is going to become a service of the Metro City, those employees that currently work in municipalities that deliver that service would become employees of the Metro City. For instance, public works, policing, courts, all of those types of services would be regional services delivered by the Metro City, and those employees would become employees of the Metro City. You asked specifically about what it means. They would keep their benefits, they would keep their rank, their salary, until otherwise decided by the Metro City. I mean, I think the Metro Council specifically, that is just saying that the Metro Council at some point, when they're elected, has the ability to set policy for this new government in the same way that the policy is made by the elected officials in a municipality right now. So a municipality may decide that they have a need to do something different. They want to give a pay raise to their employees. They make that decision. This is the same kind of thing. It's authorizing that Metro Council to make those employment decisions after whatever time they deem appropriate. But everyone is guaranteed to move to that new service if they are delivering a service for the Metro City at a metro level.
Okay, so let me, I'm sorry.
So to your second question, how are savings realized? The attrition rate actually for local government workers is actually very high. In the city of St. Louis, for instance, I believe they lose between 400 and 600 employees annually. St. Louis County is not quite that high, but it's still pretty high from an attrition standpoint. The average age of the municipal worker or the local government worker is higher than the average age locally, and for some of those jobs, they don't actually pay all that well, and so when people find other opportunities, so there are actually pretty significant savings to be found through attrition over time.
So let me focus on the two positions that are common in every city. You either have a city administrator, or you have a city manager, and you always have a finance director. What are going to happen to those folks?
Those individuals, those are services, administrative services that are still provided by the municipal districts. Those services that remain at the municipal district level will still need to be administered, and so those jobs would be with those municipal districts. Thank you.
Just two quick questions. The
Yes,
first
sir.
one, how many public meetings did you have on the plan itself, the ballot amendment, prior to it being submitted?
I don't believe we had any.
Okay. Second question, on all your facts and figures that you used to justify this, who peer reviewed it?
We consulted with, so are you asking us specifically about any?
Well, I mean, St. Louis has two very prestigious universities, three, if you count the public, UMSL. Two of those institutions have very renowned public policy administration departments.
Got it.
Was the UMSL Public Policy Department, were they consulted, or were they asked to peer review your figures?
No,
Okay,
but
thank you.
we did have officials from St. Louis County and St. Louis City and other government officials helping in the formation of those.
Any municipalities?
Well, I believe that both of those entities deliver municipal services.
No. Any municipalities in St. Louis County?
We've talked about that in the past, so no is the answer to your
Thank you.
question. Thanks. Hi, Tim.
Good evening, Marius. In the interest of full disclosure, since Marius mentioned the Municipal League, I was a director there until about 4 years ago when I retired. Spent about 25 years there. And we did have a meeting here, actually, when they first started in 2013, right before I retired. And there was a lot of skepticism because we were afraid this was not an honest data or research campaign, but the beginning of a political campaign. And most of you know from a lot of political campaigns that you've seen, there's either a lot of manipulation of data, a lot of omission of data, a lot of cherry picking of data, use of researchers who are not really researchers but are in-house data collectors. Now, I wasn't going to get into a few of these things, but Marius brought them up earlier about the government expense. He said Indianapolis, a peer city, spends $750 million less than we do. We asked the University of Missouri, and I contributed some personal money to this, to do some research to back up their claim. The University of Missouri said, and I've got a handout, about 25 handouts here, and the studies on the university website, that Better Together left out $590 million worth of Indianapolis expenses that we pay here. Indianapolis pays there, but we're not recorded in the study. So this isn't our, this isn't
Is there a
in-house research, and I'd like Marius to address why that university study and your study, which we can't get the background information on, don't comport.
So I couldn't tell you why they don't comport. We met with the researcher that you all hired from UMSL multiple times before he published his findings. I know I wasn't in those meetings, but two of my colleagues were. But I will say that you just made a point to try to say that our findings were necessarily biased or had some conclusion baked in.
Exactly.
And I think that logic applies to what you just described as being an independent study. You hired this researcher from UMSL to do this work. That researcher was paid by the Municipal League or City Strong to do that work and could presumably fall to the same biases. Secondly,
No, he's independent. He was not an in-house. I didn't do the.
he's also an elected official in one of the municipalities. But Terry Jones was not the researcher for that study. And so I'm saying that the logic there is not sound. But
Yes, it is. We used independent, highly qualified PhD
Okay.
research, and we have 100 pages of data that support this. Yours has zero data because you wouldn't give it to us.
we did meet with the researcher and gave him all the data.
No, you did not.
We just have to disagree on this one, sir.
You also said 75% of the police departments are unaccredited. That may be true. What happens, it takes about 5 years to become accredited. St. Louis County is one of the leaders in small municipalities becoming accredited. But it takes 5 years. You can't even be a member of the municipal league if you're not on the path to accreditation. University City was one of the first about 20 years ago. St. Louis County followed. St. Louis City followed. Others feel like they can meet most of the criteria and didn't want to pay the expense, but they are now willing to because of this attack. So De Pere, for example, didn't want to pay the $25,000 or $30,000 to prove it has everything in place for an accredited department. It will now spend that money to satisfy critics who look for negative things instead of positive things. We also take great umbrage with the fact that although we're not blaming elected officials, so to speak, but we're blaming citizens as if you don't support things regionally. But what about the zoo tax you just supported? What about the Great Rivers Greenway Parks and Trails? What about the arch tax you all voted to approve? And the list goes on, our community college. All our libraries are finishing their beautiful renovations. Those were all done way beyond your municipal boundaries, and you should get credit for not just thinking about what's in your municipalities.
Thank you for that, Tim.
Marius, also you said that you had committees that consisted of public officials, and we then failed to continue to provide those after I left. But the fact is, we provided 5 names for 5 committees, and they were given the report without ever having a meeting the night before the committee report was released. That's how shadowy this organization is. You have to insist that they open up their meetings. They may have had meetings like this, but their board of directors never had open meetings, not like your government boards of directors have open meetings. It's a shadowy organization funded by a quasi-billionaire who has one goal in mind, and that's to reduce very important taxes in the city and wonder if we can get by then when there's no earnings tax, there's no payroll tax, and the property tax, all of which are regional type taxes that go into the city of St. Louis, paid by daytime residents there, that they want to eliminate because Rex Singfield doesn't like the earnings tax, which he is forced to put on the ballot every 5 years with his hundreds of millions of dollars in extreme lobbying forces. So I would be very skeptical, and if you'd like to address that, I guess my question is, why wouldn't the board of directors meetings or your task force meetings open instead of coming out with this window dressing,
So,
claiming these community meetings are
Your
all this wonderful?
Your 2 minutes are far exceeded, but I'll let you continue because I wanted you to be able to make your statements. Your question is why weren't all of our meetings public, our board of directors meetings and our task force meetings? I mean,
Ours are.
yeah, yours are. Ours were not. And,
Shame on you.
we're not trying to hide anything. You see, if you read the report, we walk through all of the explanations for all the decisions as a part of this work. So we're not hiding anything. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Marius. How you doing?
Excuse me. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm Amy Pelker from the city of St. Anne.
Sorry. That one's...
Can I use your microphone?
You sure can. Yes, ma'am.
I have actually attended 3 or 4 Marius meetings in the past. Oh, sorry. My personal view of those were that you weren't really listening, but you were trying to get an end goal. But my questions tonight are, and I do have a little bit of a lead in, there's 2 questions though.
Okay.
Okay? Your amendment eliminates the entire Article 6 and replaces it. The new Metro City Charter is developed by Stinger and Cruson only, no vote by us. It can only be changed by a 2/3 vote of the new council, which for the first 2 years is unelected and appointed by Stinger. Metro
That's not
City's first mayor will be the individual that was in the St. Louis County executive position on January 1st, 2019, so he's already picked. Stinger gets to appoint all department heads, the Metro City lawyer, and 4 deputy mayors that will never be elected. A new 5-person board to run the city, unelected but appointed by Cruzen, with any of its successors being not elected but appointed thereafter by the Metro mayor. The president of the council only gets voted on by the council, not us, like the current city does. It virtually eliminates 30% plus of the minority leadership in St. Louis City and County, setting back advances that took decades to reach. Our most basic rights, Marius, as a citizen of the United States, is to vote in our elections for our public officials. The amendment not only eliminates our most basic right as a citizen, but further waters down our voices by allowing the entire state to vote in it. So the question part is, what in the U.S. Constitution gives you guys the authority to eliminate our most basic right as a citizen, which is to elect our politicians?
So thank you for your question. There's two, I want to state one thing before I answer your question. One is that the couple of things that you mentioned, I think, were a little bit off as far as who was elected and who was appointed during that process. The 33-member Metro Council is elected in November of 2022.
But they're appointed beforehand and
No.
will authorize the charter
No.
beforehand.
No,
At
no,
least
no.
that's how it reads in your amendment.
No, that's not true. They will be elected in November of 2023, and then once they take office, or excuse me, November 2022, and when they take office in January of 2023, that is when they will have a vote on the reorganization plan from the mayor
But
and the county
Stinger and
executive.
Cruzen put it together, right?
Yeah, and it is specific to administrative functions. So they're not going to be saying, the original charter is actually the charter of St. Louis County. Those two individuals aren't going to be saying, this is how the legislature works, we're going to change these things. They're saying, this is how the departments will look under this, and then
But they
have
can.
that approved by the Metro Council. I'm sorry.
But they could because they have the authority to, right?
No, I don't believe they do have the authority to, but I will find out a more clear answer on that for you. Can I answer her question? And then your question was, what in the U.S. Constitution?
Gives you guys the right to take away our right to vote.
So
I mean, they're going
notice-
6 years without anybody voting. This is a new form of government. This is a brand new form of government. It doesn't exist in the state's constitution. And not one of us gets to vote on Stinger being our head mayor.
So there's a vote. There's a vote in November of 2020, and it is a constitutional amendment. Now, I know that you and many others in this room don't like the statewide piece, but you referred to the Constitution and the authority that it gives to states. Municipalities derive their authority from the Constitution of Missouri, from the state.
Exactly.
Right.
And we have
So-
to do what it says. We can't do anything that it doesn't say.
Right, and so that is the level that is appropriate for creating a new form of government for local government, is through that state authority.
Right, but
And that's what this would do. So, but to your,
But
I
you
think,
picked the head guy, and you put him in the amendment.
well, the
so
voters
that
of St.
we
Louis
so that we
County
had
elected him.
so that we have to go with him. The voters of the city of St. Louis did not elect Stinger.
Right, so the voters of St. Louis County elected him.
They elected him to be
Will you allow me to
the
respond?
executive. Go ahead.
So there was a few things that went into the thought process for that transition. First and foremost was ensuring that during that transition period, that 2-year transition, where there was stability for this new government, for this region, that services around policing, around the economy, continued to be delivered and be able to function. So that was the first priority in thinking about this, and then looking at other places who had gone down a similar path. The idea behind that was you would have an all-new Metro Council elected in January of 2021, or elected in November, taking office in January 2023. And you wanted to have some folks from the old government, so not just the county executive, but also the prosecutor and the assessor, transition to the new government when it stands up, so that there's some continuity. The other piece of that is the reality that the heads of this transition, the mayor and the county executive, the alternative would be to have a vote at the same time in that November 2022 time. And that reality would necessitate a political campaign going on in the background of those two individuals and the region trying to stand up a new government. And those things were deemed as being undesirable for the success of a new government.
Okay, but quite often when the state passes things, they give a set date when they go into effect. Is there any reason that you couldn't have set that date to be a year out, giving people a chance to run for that new Metro City mayor? It didn't have to take place like 2 months later.
Yeah, I can look into the answer to that. I'm not quite sure I understand. I would have to think about what that timeline looked like to be able to answer your question.
Okay. But you do have my phone number, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So, second question.
Yes. And then we're gotta keep going because.
Right.
Ooh, yes.
Presumably, one of the reasons for this amendment is to create equity for all areas of St. Louis.
Yeah.
Yet, we only need to look to the very examples you shove at us, Louisville and Indianapolis, to see that equity has not been accomplished in those cities, most of which have been working on this for a decade or more. As of a 2015 poverty study, St. Louis had less poverty than both of those cities. Indianapolis was at 20.6, Louisville was at 16.7, and St. Louis combined was at 14.5. In your meeting last week on 3/14, you, Marius, stated that the municipal districts would be able to levy additional taxes to get better services, which means, say, the municipal district of Wildwood can levy additional taxes. For what? Not police and streets. Your amendment is very specific. So my question then is, what about this amendment then means equity for all? If a municipal district cannot afford the extra taxes, they will get less services, and we already have that in municipalities.
So that's not entirely true, in that the idea of equity is around making sure that everyone in the region can have a base level of service that does not exist today. So in many places, we do enjoy professional police that are hired and paid a good salary and have all the equipment provided to them. In other places, we don't. And so one of the things that we heard in our process and in looking at the other studies that were considered as a part of this work, including the Ferguson Commission report, For the Sake of All, was that there needed to be some key services like policing and like municipal courts delivered on a regional basis to ensure that everyone gets a base level of service. You mentioned that meeting where I said that municipal districts can, if they desire to have an additional level of service above and beyond that base level, they can raise property tax in their area to, if they wanted to have additional patrols beyond the basic level from the police department, they could do that.
So you
If they
are
wanted
gonna
have
let 'em-
additional services, they could do that.
So we
But
can have police and extra street.
They have to have it contracted from the Metro Police Department.
Right.
Through that administration. They can say yes, they can say no.
No, for the municipal district, if they wanted to levy a property tax in that municipal district, the elected officials,
For police.
right, they can say in De Pere, they could, or whatever municipality.
They could say we want this just for the police, that is raised, and then it has to go through the county administration.
No, it would be approved by the De Pere City Council and then voted on by the people in that municipal district,
Okay, but
in the
That-
same way that it does today.
that still goes back to my question, though, because I didn't think police or streets would be part of it. So now you're saying that streets and police can be part of those extra services, but then we're right back to the same thing we're doing already.
But we're not
I've got
doing it
5
right.
guys on
So the
24/7.
key difference that I'm saying to you is that right now, not everybody has an adequate level of base service. And
But they're
that's
not going-
the key change.
But they're
The
not
other
going
thing-
to either if we can just raise our taxes and get more.
No, you can have a premium level of service above what that base level adequate is.
But
everyone's
then-
going to have access to that base level of service.
But then those same
but I
cities
wanna
that don't
say
have it now aren't going to have it then.
they will have an adequate level of service that does not exist today. And I think that's the difference. The other thing, and I want to make sure to get to some of the other folks because we're getting close on time here. We've got another 15 or so minutes. Is that one of the things I'll be frank with you, Amy, we really had some internal discussions about that issue as well, because we want to make sure that equity is provided, that everyone has access to adequate services, particularly around public safety. We know that does not exist today. Well, if you allow these cities to have above and beyond, you have premium service, what does that say towards the goals of equity? And ultimately where the task force members fell was that they heard from people in the residents that they wanted the ability to do some of those things, those cultural things, whether it be farmers markets or parades or the things that helped identify their community, and we wanted to make sure that they still had that ability to do those things. So,
And that's for the property tax.
yes. Yes, sir.
Can I use the mic?
Sure.
Thank you. My name is Greg Carl, and I'm a council person in the city of Olivet.
Okay.
I acknowledge you have a very difficult job tonight. One thing I would suggest is instead of saying that's not exactly true, I would say that's not exactly correct. It seems less inflammatory.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Then a follow on to the question that occurred to me from the last speaker, real quickly. What if some municipal district creates a premium level of service and then the county council votes to dissolve that municipal district, which is within their power? What happens to that premium level of service?
So I think one of the things that we have to be cognizant of, and this is that those citizens still have a voice in this government, both through their elected representative within the Metro Council and their elected representatives at that municipal district level to advocate for their needs. And so I would think that would be an extremely high bar for them to say we're going to dissolve any municipality. I mean, I think
Municipality, municipal district.
municipal district. Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you. Now to my question. Third and fourth and charter cities are defined in state statute and constitution. So I understand why the metro city form of government must be created that way. But why create that form of government for St. Louis and St. Louis only? Why can't KC, Springfield, Joplin, or any other region be availed of that same form of government? Why can't the statewide amendment create the metro city form of government and court system and let each region individually decide if they want to have that form of government?
So I think that question just drills down to what we had a level of knowledge and research on. We didn't study the government in Springfield or in Kansas City. They don't have the unique issues that we have here in St. Louis. And so we were tailoring, crafting recommendations specific to this region. And that's really where that comes down to. I'm going to let you respond, and then we'll want to make sure we get to other folks.
It's all follow-up questions. So that's fine. We can still create the metro city, because I'm going to kind of amend this to what you just said.
Okay.
That's fine. We can still create the metro city form of government in the Constitution by a statewide vote for St. Louis only. But why not then let the existing Board of Freeholders process decide whether or not to have that form of government for the region, rather than letting the whole state decide whether St. Louis has that form of government?
Okay. I understand your question. Thank you. So we explored similar outcomes, and it really came down to two critical questions. Essentially, your question sounds, and please correct me if this is not accurate, like some other questions we've heard at some of the previous town halls. Why not have subsequent votes around this issue? One authorizing this form of government, and then another one adopting it locally. That drills down to two points. One, the Board of Freeholders process as it stands is not, in order to consolidate the police departments and the municipal courts and also maintain those municipal identities, you needed to have craft a solution that was outside of what is currently available to the Board of Freeholders. The Board of Freeholders, anything that comes out of that is subject to general laws in the state of Missouri. For instance, the law that says municipalities of 400 or more have to have or contract for municipal police departments or policing. And so that was incompatible with the Board of Freeholders. One of the other things, and we haven't talked a lot about it here tonight, as far as some of the findings and some of the things that we and I think many others in this region have come to learn about our current delivery of certain services, particularly in the municipal courts, is that these things are having an extremely detrimental impact on people's lives. Many of the people who have been caught up in the system for whatever reason, whether it was an initial fault of their own or overly aggressive policing, whatever the reason that they've caught up in the system, people have lost their jobs, they've lost homes. This is impacting people on a day-to-day basis. So our status quo structure is not benign. And there's an urgency, I think, in trying to resolve the structure that having the subsequent votes and drawing this process out over a longer period of time does not speak to. The other part of that is there's, from a legal perspective, some uncertainty as to where you can draw that line. So if St. Louis City and St. Louis County say that, yes, we derive our authority from the Constitution, we demand to have a local vote on this. Well, there are also more than a dozen charter cities in St. Louis County that derive their authority from the Constitution as well. And so what is to stop those places legally from saying we demand our own independent voice, from us having 15 votes on this issue before we get to a final conclusion on what our form of government is going to be. So there's two pieces there. And I know that that's a piece that's really irks a lot of folks, but that's the answer.
My only comment to what you said,
yes, sir.
and it's not, I'll be quick, is that you seem like you're disenfranchising this region in choosing their form of government when you don't have to. And I understand there's a sense of urgency, but you can get the metro government, and if this region can choose it, people fight wars over being able to vote. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna just give a heads up. It is 7:12 right now. I'll take the next few folks in line here, but I want to have our organizers, Jack and Abby, start getting the questions from folks in line so that we can respond to you individually, because I want to be respectful of people's times. We set a time for this event, and I just want to be respectful for everyone in the room, and I'll stick around for a little bit afterwards to continue to answer questions as well.
My name's Caroline Fan, and I don't.
That's
Does this one
here.
work or okay?
Yeah, still speaking to that one because it's for the camera.
Okay. My name's Caroline Fan. My question is about the special taxation districts. So, what happens to the existing districts, and then how are new ones created? Because my impression is that part of the savings would be by not letting every single municipality have like 20 TIFs. So I guess it's also a little bit of a follow-up on the previous questions about what happens to taxes that particular municipalities create. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Caroline. So the question is about special taxing districts. All special taxing districts that currently exist would continue to exist on this metro city. And most of those districts, whether it be a TIF or community improvement district or transportation development district, have, as a part of the statute or the ordinance that authorize them, have sunset dates. And so once they sunset out, of those taxes would then go away in that area. To create a new special taxing district, that would be done through the Metro Council. The elected officials in the municipal districts would serve as the Board of Adjustment and Planning to the Metro Council. So they would suggest, let's say someone was requesting a TIF or some new special taxing district or a zoning change, they would make the recommendation to the Metro Council, and then the Metro Council would be the ones that ultimately make that vote. That would be up to the Metro Council to determine how they want to handle that specific function. Yeah. Councilman Fitch.
Hi, Marius.
Hi, it's good to see you.
How are you?
Doing well.
Poor Marius, you got thrown up here in front of all these folks. Where's your bosses? Why aren't they here?
I am a representative of Better Together as well. Actually, some of them are at other meetings tonight.
He's a
too.
good man. Take my word for it. My name is Tim Fitch. I'm St. Louis County Councilman. So my question is going back to your first slide.
Okay.
Your first slide said that when you did the study, 75% of police departments in St. Louis County were unaccredited, correct?
Yes.
What's the percentage today?
I would have to I'd have to look, but from what I've heard from other municipalities, it's close to 90% are accredited or seeking on the way to accreditation.
Isn't that a big difference between what the slide says? Does that give you an idea where we're going with this? It's just, so they say 75% unaccredited, right? Isn't that what you all saw? But you just heard them say it's about 90%, which is right. So why doesn't it say 90% are accredited or in the process? You follow me here? Does this give you any idea of what's going on here? They're giving you what they want to give you. And by the way, it's not your fault.
Can I tell you
Sure.
the reason behind that? So all the data that we put out in our presentations is reflective of the research that we've done.
Then say that.
Okay, I don't.
It's not accurate today.
So what I said was that when we did our study, 75% of those.
Did you all hear
departments-
that, or did you see the slide? Yeah.
Okay, well, what I was going to say is the second part of that sentence was that we've not verified that 90% figure. That's what I've heard publicly. When we did our policing study, we spent over $25,000 collecting data from municipalities.
Who helped you find the people to do the study? Me. I helped them find the people that did the study. So they asked me is there a consultant that does police studies? Sure there is. It's called Police Executive Research Forum. I'm a member. So they do the study, and at the end of the study, what it says is they do not recommend wholesale consolidation of police departments. So why is that what we're hearing?
Well, the sentence immediately preceding that in the study
It talks
says.
about municipal, but district police departments.
The sentence immediately preceding that says that in an ideal world, we would have one police department for the region.
That's not what it says. The conclusion, the recommendation.
And then the recommendation goes on to offer clusters for policing for areas.
How does it end?
I'm not going to do this back and forth.
You know how it ends.
No, I don't know specifically what you're asking about, but let me finish my sentence and then I'll let you respond. There's a couple things. One, there's, I believe, 14 recommendations as a part of that Police Executive Research Forum study. 3 or perhaps 4 of them were specific clusters recommended for agencies coming together. There's no way to reach those specific clusters under the way we're currently structured in the state of Missouri other than voluntary action by those departments. There just simply is not. We've seen efforts at reforming police in other ways, whether that be through Senate Bill 5 or through the county council's efforts to implement minimum standards sued out of existence. And so there was no other mechanism to get to reforming police departments. And I think the point you make about the 90% police departments being accredited has some validity to it.
Change your slide.
Our slides reflect the research that we've done. We've not done that research. So, however, I think the important piece there is that accreditation process is important and still voluntary. And in those places where that 10% doesn't exist and those people are not on the track to getting accreditation, those are the places most in need of more equitable policing. And I think we both agree on that.
And I agree. There's 4 police departments that have not started the accreditation process out of 55. So one last thing, you're having all these town halls. That's great. I think it's wonderful that they force you to come up here and talk. However,
nobody's holding a gun to my head here.
My question is this: is there any room for negotiation in this plan, or is it a done deal? If it's a done deal, why are we all here? And I'll leave you alone.
Thank you, Councilman. I mean, there's 2 things. One, there's recommendations are what they are based on the public feedback that we've had over 5 years. There are folks that want to have open negotiations about this. I think from a practical standpoint, that is not practical. Secondly, Better Together as an entity actually doesn't control the process. It's Unite STL is a different organization that is the ones that submitted that. So you would have to ask those individuals. Thanks. We have time for 2 more questions. Yeah, I'll talk to folks. If you want to have your question answered, I want to make sure to answer them. We have folks here who will take them and will respond to you on an individual basis.
Hi, my name is Chris Claus, and my question is, if there are problems of basic services, police departments, courts, etc., which I do believe there is, why haven't those individual municipalities and/or the city those problems been addressed specifically instead of trying to dismantle cities who do operate fiscally responsible?
So there have been efforts to try to make reforms around those areas, and the reality is some of the reforms have had levels of success, things like Senate Bill 5 from 2015, which tried to remove the incentive for collecting revenue in those municipal courts, has had moderate success on some fronts, but there's still a fundamental problem of a lack of oversight for those municipal courts, and there's no guarantee first of all, it hasn't eradicated all the problems. We saw in a Post-Dispatch story a few weeks ago that is still the case, and there are still many abuses happening in those courts. There's no mechanism outside of state action to do this. These governments derive their authority from the state, and that's how it's set up in the law. So, yeah.
Okay. My next question is, what assurance can you give me that the Metro City will provide the services I currently enjoy in my city of Fenton?
So there is a provision in the amendment, and I don't know, I can't cite to it specifically off the top of my head, I have to look, that actually says that the services have to be the same on right now to what they will be. But in any government, that's going to be, there's going to be some flux in that, and it's up to the elected officials to continue to deliver on their delivery of services. So I can't, as a person standing here, make any kind of guarantee to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Terry Franks. First, I just wanted to say that a lot of people in this room do not bear the brunt of an accredited or unaccredited police department. A lot of y'all don't. Secondly, the people who do, who don't have a voice, are not here. And they can't be here for many reasons. So I just wanted to say that. Also, with these court systems and these police departments and all these government entities that have a lot of people up under them that they govern, they don't do it fairly and they don't do it professionally. So with his group, I don't know, but all I do know is that St. Louis is always in the top, 1 to 10, 1 through 10 in crime, murders, but everything is still okay. I mean, these governments, these fragmented cities are fine. No, they're not. And you people don't bear the brunt of what goes on. I can tell you some things that will shock your brains, that will totally shock your brains. That's happened to my kids, happened to a lot of people's kids that you guys don't even know.
We're electing the same people in the city of St. Louis. Elect people and hold them.
Well, you can elect the same people, but make sure they're not corrupt. We'll probably get the best. We'll probably get the best people. We'll probably
Let's please be respectful.
We'll probably
Let's
get
please be
people
respectful.
based on merit. Maybe we can get people that are based on merit and people who have performance. I'm not saying that y'all's people aren't gonna perform or be able to handle the government. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, with the Better Together, maybe we can get the best people, the people who have a track record, the people who have merit and performance. So we don't get corrupt people. We don't get people who treat other people like they're less than nothing.
Thank you. Did you have a question? Thank you. Yeah, I was actually about to address that. So I said that we were going to do 2 more questions. I will stay and talk to the folks here.
Give me 1 second. Let's take me 1 minute.
Well, I can't do that because the same principle would apply to all the other folks in line. And so I'll speak with you.
Okay, let me just talk like this. Hey, I made the website, and it's not that great, but it's got links to a lot of stuff on there. It's stlvote.net.
Okay, thank you.
And that right there, we need help.
So really quickly before we conclude, I want to make sure, because I know that there are more questions and people have more concerns, it's not coming up, but well, there are also people who already sat down, and I don't want to be disrespectful to them. And moreover, I'm willing to stay and answer their questions. I just want to be able to conclude the evening. So the thing I wanted to say is that I hope this conversation continues. We know that this is not the end of this conversation. There's a lot of time between now and November 2020. I want to encourage you to continue to ask your questions. whether it be here tonight or in the different formats that we have available, whether that be on social media. We have a portal on our website called Ask Us Anything. You can go and see previously asked questions, frequently asked questions, and understand the answers to those. Submit your own that we will answer, and we do our best to get back to every single person who submitted a question. And then the best way to do that is bettertogetherstl.com, bettertogetherstl.com/ask specifically to that question. But again, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and thank you so much for your input.